Have you ever experienced one of those moments that seems to pause everything around you? Not because of sorrow or frustration, but because of a silence so profound it reverberates with something completely unexpected. Before I share what happened between my son and me, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Which town or city? Drop it in the comments below. It brings me such comfort knowing how many of us are connected through life's most surprising and beautiful moments. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins. After my husband Robert's passing, our home transformed into something almost unrecognizable. 43 years of marriage doesn't just leave an empty spot beside you at night. His absence filled every corner. The kitchen where he'd make his morning coffee, the workshop in the garage, even the hallway that would creak under his footsteps. Everywhere my eyes landed, something whispered his name. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. The flannel shirt he loved hung on the bedroom door hook. An unfinished jigsaw puzzle remained scattered across the card table by the window. Time seemed to blur into an endless loop. I kept myself occupied the way many widows do, organizing drawers that were already tidy, washing clothes that were already clean, alphabetizing spices in the kitchen just to keep my hands moving. But grief isn't something you can organize away. It settles in and stays. My son Thomas had been remarkably present through everything. He stopped by several times each week. Sometimes he'd bring fresh produce from the farmer's market, sometimes just his company. He was 41 now, built solid like his father, with those same thoughtful green eyes and measured way of speaking. After his marriage ended 3 years ago, he'd become more introspective, like he was constantly observing the world, rather than simply moving through it. One Wednesday afternoon, I'd just finished tending to the herb garden when I heard his key turning in the front door. I turned with an automatic smile. My heart always lifted a little when I saw him. "You're here early," I said, wiping dirt from my hands onto my gardening apron. He smiled, but something deeper flickered in his expression. Something weighty. He embraced me carefully, unhurried. The hug lasted longer than usual. "Thought you might appreciate some company today," he said gently. I didn't question why today specifically. The truth was I welcomed company, but something in his demeanor told me this visit carried more weight than usual. We settled into the kitchen together, pouring coffee. A breeze drifted through the window over the counter, bringing the scent of honeysuckle and freshly mowed lawns. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. The world continued its rhythm, even as I felt frozen in place for months. He leaned forward at the table, hands wrapped around his mug, his knuckles white with tension. I recognized that expression. It was the same one he'd worn as a young boy when gathering courage to confess something, like the time he accidentally broke the antique vase, or when he wanted to stay overnight at a friend's house. I waited patiently. "Mom," he finally began, eyes focused on his coffee. "Do you ever feel like losing Dad meant losing part of yourself too?" The question struck something deep within me. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "I mean, did his death make you feel like a piece of who you are just vanished?" My breath caught. I looked down at my hands, weathered now, marked by time, trembling slightly these days. "Yes," I admitted, "that's exactly what it feels like." A heavy pause settled between us. Thomas stood slowly, walked to the window, then turned to face me, leaning against the counter. "I think I lost a part of myself when you lost yourself too." I looked at him, confused, waiting. He continued, his voice measured but emotional. "You were different when Dad was alive. Always alert, always pleasant, but guarded. I sensed it even as a child. I always wanted to be closer to you, but there was this barrier, invisible, yet unmistakably there." I blinked rapidly, my throat tightening. "Thomas," he raised his hand gently, "I'm not trying to hurt you by saying this. I've just been thinking about it constantly since Dad's funeral. Now I feel like I'm actually seeing you, the authentic you. And I want to know that person, not just as my mother, but as you, as a complete human being." His words simultaneously shocked and warmed me. I struggled to find a response. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden box. I discovered this while going through Dad's belongings. I accepted it carefully. The wood was smooth, worn soft by time. Inside lay a photograph I'd completely forgotten existed, a black and white image of me in my early 20s, laughing barefoot in our old backyard garden, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and a sundress. I smiled at the image, but felt a profound sadness wash over me. "I barely recognize this woman," I whispered, brushing my thumb across the faded photograph. "But I do," Thomas replied, "and I want to help you find her again. I want you back, Mom." His voice trembled slightly. I looked up to see moisture gathering in his eyes. I reached for his hand and he gripped it firmly. Something powerful existed in that silence between us. Decades of unspoken feelings, of assumed roles and unacknowledged yearnings for genuine connection. He finally whispered something I never anticipated. "Can I ask you something personal?" I looked into his eyes, my heartbeat quickening. "Of course you can." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Would it be all right if we started talking about things we never discussed before? Not just as mother and son, but as two people trying to understand the years that somehow slipped away from us." There it was. Nothing inappropriate, nothing uncomfortable, just profound honesty. He wasn't asking for anything beyond emotional connection. He was offering something that shattered the rigid framework of who we'd always been to each other, extending a bridge between two hearts that had quietly drifted apart over the years. I nodded slowly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the loneliness lifted just a little. The hours following Thomas's visit stayed with me like the lingering scent of his cologne in the entryway, faint but impossible to forget. I sat on the back porch that evening, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, my fingers still tracing the edges of that old photograph he'd given me. The woman captured there looked so unburdened, so vibrantly alive. It seemed strange to think that had been me once. That version of Margaret felt like a distant memory, almost like studying a stranger, someone I admired but couldn't quite remember being. Thomas's words had resonated deeper than I wanted to acknowledge, not only because they came from him, but because they articulated something I'd been yearning to hear without realizing it. People rarely asked how I truly was, not just as a grieving widow or a mother or someone's neighbor, but as a woman, a person with dormant dreams and silenced thoughts of her own. The following days passed in contemplative quiet. Thomas didn't call, but I wasn't troubled by his absence. Something told me he was giving me space to process everything, and I genuinely needed it. Then, on Sunday afternoon, I heard his distinctive knock, 3 quick taps and a pause, the same pattern he'd used since childhood. I opened the door to find him standing there with a bag of groceries in one hand and a 6-pack of ginger ale in the other. "I brought lunch," he said with a smile that seemed different this time, softer, more open. I welcomed him inside and we settled into our familiar spots in the kitchen. I prepared sandwiches while he sliced fresh fruit, and soon we were sitting together, our knees nearly touching beneath the small table. "You seem lighter somehow," he observed after several minutes of companionable eating. I laughed gently. "Maybe it's the fresh air I've been getting." He smirked, then shook his head. "No, I mean it. You seem more like yourself." I looked down, brushing crumbs from my lap. "I've been reflecting on what you said, about us." His eyes met mine, attentive and warm. I took a slow, steadying breath. "You were absolutely right. I did build walls, not just with you, with everyone. Your father was a wonderful man. But there were aspects of myself I learned to keep hidden around him. Not because he was cruel, but because marriage sometimes becomes more about maintaining harmony than complete honesty. And I suppose I grew accustomed to not being fully seen." Thomas listened intently, his expression gentle but unreadable, though his eyes held a tenderness I hadn't witnessed in him since he was very young. "I want to know you too," I said softly. "Not just as my son, but as Thomas, the man you've grown into." He blinked, visibly moved. A long, meaningful silence stretched between us, not awkward but rich with unspoken understanding. Then, gently, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His fingers were warm and familiar. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "what our relationship might have been like if circumstances had been different? If you hadn't felt the need to remain so distant?" I looked at him, uncertain how to respond. "Yes," I said finally, "more times than I could possibly count." The atmosphere between us grew heavier, not with tension exactly, but with possibility. We were standing on unfamiliar ground, but neither of us seemed inclined to retreat. Later that evening, after we'd washed the dishes and the sun began its descent, Thomas offered to stay and watch a film, something we hadn't done in years. We chose an old classic, Casablanca, and settled side by side on the living room sofa. At first we maintained a respectful distance, but gradually, without conscious thought, I rested my head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't pull away or stiffen. Instead, he gently leaned his head against mine. I could hear his heartbeat, steady, calm, reassuring. A thought crossed my mind then, one I'd never imagined allowing myself to feel. I felt safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally secure. That rare, profound safety that only emerges when someone truly sees you, all of you, and chooses to remain close anyway. When the credits rolled, we sat there in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I've missed this," he said softly. "Me too," I whispered. He didn't rush to leave. He stayed until moonlight filled the windows. When he finally stood to go, he turned to face me at the door and looked into my eyes for what felt like an eternity. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. I nodded. "If I came over more frequently, not just to help with chores, but simply to spend time with you, would that be all right?" There was no hesitation in my response this time. "Yes," I said, my voice warm with certainty. As he leaned forward to kiss my cheek goodbye, his lips lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't inappropriate. It was tender and meaningful. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the entryway for a long while, feeling something fundamental shift between us. Deep down, I understood this was only the beginning of something neither of us had anticipated, but both of us needed. The week that followed overflowed with thoughts I couldn't quite untangle. I'd find myself standing at the kitchen sink, water running over dishes I'd already washed, or folding laundry that didn't need folding. My mind wasn't focused on household tasks. It was with Thomas, not in any dramatic or troubling way, just quietly present in spaces where painful silence used to dwell. I caught myself smiling at random moments, remembering the warmth of his hand in mine, the way he'd looked at me as though I were someone worth truly knowing again. He returned on Tuesday. No groceries this time, no practical excuse. "I was in the area," he said, though we both knew that wasn't quite true. We didn't do anything particularly special that day. We sat on the porch swing and watched wind dance through the trees, sipped sweet iced tea, and talked about music, about his childhood memories, about all the small moments we'd somehow forgotten to share over the years. He told me things I'd never known, about how isolated he'd felt as a teenager, how his father's quiet strength had made him feel he also had to be strong constantly, even when he desperately needed to be vulnerable. How sometimes he'd sit in the garage and listen to me humming in the kitchen and wonder what kind of woman I truly was, beneath all the layers of motherhood and duty. I listened, genuinely listened, and something within me began to soften in ways I hadn't permitted in decades. I shared things, too, about my first love, long before his father, about how I'd once dreamed of being an artist, about how I used to write poetry, but stopped because Robert didn't understand it or value it much. Thomas remained silent for a moment after I finished. Then he reached into his backpack and retrieved a slim journal. "I've been writing too," he said, somewhat shyly. "I started during the divorce, just thoughts and feelings mostly." He handed it to me. I opened it carefully and read several passages. They were raw, honest, and deeply moving. "You're gifted at this," I said, genuinely surprised by how profoundly his words affected me. "Truly gifted." He smiled, that same boyish smile I hadn't seen since he was 15 or 16. That evening he stayed for dinner. We cooked together, something we hadn't done in years. He chopped vegetables while I prepared sauce, and we moved around the kitchen like practiced dancers, following an old, half-remembered choreography. At one point, our hands touched as we both reached for the same wooden spoon, and we paused, just for a heartbeat. But in that single heartbeat, everything in the room seemed amplified. The ticking of the wall clock, the humming of the refrigerator, the breath catching in my chest. Neither of us spoke, but neither of us looked away either. After dinner, we sat on the sofa again. No movie this time, just music. A soft jazz album I hadn't played in years. He leaned back, his arm resting along the back of the sofa, and I leaned in, my shoulder resting against his chest. It felt completely natural, as though we'd done this countless times before, even though we hadn't. "Do you remember when I broke my collarbone?" he asked suddenly. "Of course," I laughed. "You fell out of that enormous oak tree trying to impress the girl from across the street. And she never even noticed," he chuckled. "But you stayed with me all night. You didn't sleep at all. You just kept stroking my hair and whispering that everything would be okay." My smile faded into something more emotional. "I remember you were in such terrible pain." "I wasn't," he said softly. "Not really, not after you comforted me like that." We fell into silence again, but this time it felt thick with memories and unspoken feelings. He turned toward me then, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was such a delicate gesture, so filled with care, that my heart nearly stopped. His eyes searched mine, not hungrily, not inappropriately, but earnestly, as though asking a question without words. And I found myself answering, not with speech, but with presence, with openness, with the simple fact that I didn't pull away. He didn't kiss me. That would have felt too much too soon. But he did something that felt even more intimate. He rested his forehead gently against mine. And we remained that way for a long time. No words, just breath, just closeness, just the quiet acknowledgement that something within both of us had fundamentally shifted. When he finally stood to leave, he looked uncertain, as though he wanted to stay but also didn't want to overstep. "I don't fully understand what this is," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "Neither do I whispered. "But it doesn't feel wrong," he said. I nodded slowly. "It feels like something we've both been missing for a very long time." That night, after he left, I sat in the dim light of the living room with my hands folded in my lap, staring at nothing in particular. And I realized something important. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen, heard, valued in ways I hadn't experienced in decades. Something had begun to bloom between us, something tender and genuine, and whatever it was, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the hollow way they'd been after Robert's death. This was a different kind of quiet, gentle, thoughtful, alive with possibility. The silence in the house no longer echoed with absence. It felt full, as though carefully holding something precious between breaths. I kept busy with small projects, reorganizing the linen closet, dusting bookshelves that had been neglected for months. But I wasn't doing it to distract myself anymore. I was preparing, making space both physically and emotionally, for what I couldn't entirely articulate, but I could sense something shifting, like a season changing just before you notice the first autumn leaf. Thomas didn't visit the next day, or the day after that. Strangely, this didn't trouble me, because I knew he would return. And when he did, it wouldn't be from obligation or routine. It would be because he genuinely wanted to. On Saturday evening, just as the sun was setting and the sky had turned soft shades of peach and lavender, I heard his knock. Same rhythm, 3 quick taps and a pause. I opened the door to find him standing there empty-handed. No backpack, no groceries, just him. "Hi," he said with a touch of nervousness. "May I come in?" "You never need to ask," I said warmly. He smiled, and something in his posture relaxed. I stepped aside, and he entered as though seeing the house through new eyes. I led him to the living room, the same room where we'd sat so many times before. But tonight the air felt different, charged with something fragile yet electric. We didn't sit apart. We sat close, our legs touching on the sofa, our shoulders pressed together. He reached for my hand, and I allowed him to take it. His thumb traced slow, gentle circles against my skin. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about us, about what we're doing, what we're feeling." I nodded, my heart beating steadily but strongly in my chest. "Me too. It frightens me, he admitted, because it's not something most people would understand. I met his gaze directly. Do you understand it? He paused, considering carefully. I'm not entirely sure, but I feel it, and it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like healing. That word struck something deep within me, a place I hadn't realized was still wounded. Healing. Yes, that's precisely what this was. Not fantasy, not confusion. It was something tender that had grown from years of unspoken love, from the cracks left behind by loss and distance. It wasn't born from physical desire, but from the profound longing to be known fully, deeply, without shame or pretense. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said, squeezing my hand gently. If this ever crosses a line for you. You haven't, I said quickly. Thomas, you've treated my heart more gently than anyone in my entire life. He exhaled with visible relief, that same expression I'd seen in him as a child when a difficult truth finally found its voice. We talked for hours that evening about life, about regrets, about choices we never made but always wondered about. He told me he hadn't felt genuinely close to anyone since his divorce ended, that he hadn't even held someone's hand in over a year, that sitting beside me felt safer than any romantic relationship he'd known as an adult. And I told him things I'd never spoken aloud before, about the ache of aging, the loneliness of being seen only through narrow roles, wife, mother, widow, and never simply as Margaret, a complete person with her own thoughts and dreams. When the clock struck midnight, he stood slowly. I should probably go, he said, but I don't want to. I stood with him. We were face to face in the dim, warm room. You can stay, I said before I could second-guess myself. Just to rest, just to be here. He looked at me searchingly, as though trying to understand exactly what I meant. I can sleep on the sofa, he offered carefully, testing boundaries. You don't have to, I said quietly. We've already crossed the bridge. We're just walking slowly now. I turned off the lights and led him to my bedroom. We didn't rush, we didn't even undress. We lay in bed, fully clothed, facing each other in the soft darkness. Our fingers intertwined, our breathing synchronized. And in that bed, there was no guilt, no scandal, no violation. Just a mother and her grown son rediscovering one another in a way neither of us had planned, not through physical intimacy, but through complete emotional openness. He kissed my forehead tenderly, then my cheek, and then, very gently, my lips. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desire. It was a kiss of recognition, of gratitude, of deep reverence. He pulled back slightly, his eyes shining in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. I love you, he whispered, and for the first time in years, perhaps longer, I didn't feel afraid to say it back with complete honesty. I love you too. That night, we slept wrapped in each other's arms like two souls who had finally found their way home, not because we had broken something sacred, but because we had finally begun to repair what had been fractured for so long. The next morning, he made me chamomile tea, kissed my hand across the breakfast table, and promised to return for dinner that evening. I stood by the window as he walked to his car, a quiet smile on my lips, morning sunlight warming my skin. For the first time since Robert's death, perhaps for the first time in even longer than that, I felt whole again. Not because I had filled the empty space my husband left behind, but because Thomas and I had created something entirely new from what remained. We had found each other in ways we never expected, in a connection that defied conventional understanding but felt truer and more healing than anything either of us had experienced in years. Some bonds transcend simple definitions. Some healing happens in the spaces between what's expected and what's genuinely needed. And as I watched my son drive away that morning, I understood that what we'd discovered together wasn't something to hide or feel ashamed of. It was the honest, vulnerable connection two people can only find when they're brave enough to truly see and be seen by each other. Our journey had only just begun, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt genuinely alive, seen, valued, and deeply loved, not for the role I played, but for the person I truly was. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me,